All right, well, thank you to Nick and Olivia for inviting our paper into the program. We're very grateful. This is joint work with Asaf Bernstein and Ryan Lewis at Colorado, someone you're mostly all probably familiar with, Mike Schwert, your former colleague for those of you that work at Wharton, and then my classmate from grad school, Maya Kargar, who's at University of Illinois. So this paper starts with the idea that unfunded pension liabilities in the public sector are enormous. $3.8 trillion when we properly discount them, and it's roughly on par, bigger than, all non-mortgage consumer finance credit. And so why do I draw that connection? Because I'm going to argue that it's households that ultimately are the residual claimant on these liabilities, and we're going to show that they care about this. We can see that this funded ratio has decreased across time, but important for our study, there's enormous heterogeneity across states in the funded ratios. And again, you guys are all perfectly familiar with this. And because these obligations, these unfunded pension liability obligations, ultimately fall on state and local government, shocks to the financing, to the fundedness of these public pensions are effectively shocks to state and local government resources. They're the ones that are ultimately going to be on the hook for this. And you can see there's nothing causal here, but just in a correlative sense, when shortfalls increase on a per property basis within a state, you can see that employers have to pay more into their pensions, employees have to pay more into their pensions, education spending goes down, road quality deteriorates in the state. There's lots of real effects of these pension shortfalls in provision of services, and of course, the pensioners themselves also face a little bit of this. So what are we going to do in this paper? We're going to use shocks to pension assets. Specifically, we're going to look at market returns, how they feed through into pension assets, and try and answer whether marginal government resources are either wasted or are they allocated efficiently. And how do individual households value an additional dollar of public wealth? This question is what we're aiming to answer very precisely. There's a large literature that looks at how different types of projects are valued by the population. Education, healthcare, parks, tax abatements. These are projects that state and local governments undertake that have a high value for homeowners, for residents of the state, But what we don't know is what projects are governments actually choosing with marginal dollars. So if we drop some quantity of cash on a state and local government, what do they do with that money? Do they put it towards high-value projects? Do they waste it? Do they burn it? Do they use it to line their pockets? All of these are possible outcomes. What we're going to try and get at is what is the value of an additional dollar inside of this budget. I'm not going to go through the difficulties. We'll come through it. Our headline is that we're going to measure something we're calling the marginal value of pension wealth. And we're going to find that every dollar of a windfall into the public pension system, so an exogenous dollar inside the pension system, is associated with a willingness to pay of $2.13. So the marginal dollar inside of a state and local government is worth $2.13 on average to the residents of that particular state. That means that every time, those of you that manage pension assets, every time you increase the return on pension assets, you're making residents of the state twice as better off as that dollar is worth. We're going to work hard to emphasize that this effect is not driven by endogenous pension investment decisions, and I'll talk more about what that is. And we're also going to work hard to show that it's not about political mismanagement or corruption or any sort of thing going on inside the state government. And then interestingly, we find that this marginal value of pension wealth is larger in financially constrained states. So if the state government has a higher bond spread on their munis, they like these dollars more. The residents like these dollars more. This is relieving to their financial constraints. And then also Democrat-controlled legislatures, states with Democrat-controlled legislatures, the residents also value these dollars more. Okay, so how do we calculate this? What we're going to do is we're going to compare two housing transactions that occur in the same year in counties right next to each other but across state borders. So that is our fundamental experimental design. This is really important because for properties at the state border, capital, spending, labor, these are all highly mobile. You can take this right across the state border very, very easily. But the real estate itself can't move across. So as soon as there's a problem, as soon as there's an extra dollar, as soon as there's some sort of shock to the state or local government, it is going to be capitalized into the value of housing right at that state border. It's not going to work on the inside of the state, and I will show you that, because there it's harder to take your shopping elsewhere, etc. Okay. So I've never been to the Indiana-Illinois border. I assume it's this militarized border here. Anyway, Indiana is working really hard to draw this sort of across. Now, we're not only focused on Indiana versus Illinois. We're looking at any border between two states. What you have here is the state-level pension shortfall per property. And all of these counties are where our sample exists, where there's sufficient population and housing transaction. Unfortunately, lots of states have decided to not make public their housing price transactions, so those are the gray states. We can't speak to those states. I know there's people from Maryland and Pennsylvania, so like maybe that's a contentious border, I don't know, and Tennessee and stuff like that. So you can find your favorite state border here and keep that in mind as we talk through the experiment. So I'm not going to bore you with this. You guys are almost surely all familiar with the public pension plan database. We get housing transactions out of deeds from Zillow. Okay, the problem is we can't look at state pension shortfalls. We have to construct a measure of something else. And the basic reason for that is if you imagine the thing of interest, which is a block of cash dropped on a state or local government or inside the pension system, they could use it to reduce shortfalls. They could spend it on projects if it's at the state and local government. They could use it to line their pockets. They could light it on fire. None of those things will help us very much. The shortfall itself is endogenous to what's going on inside of the state. So what we're going to do is we're going to construct a measure called pension windfalls, where we are going to take asset levels in the pension system in 2001, and we are going to just calculate cumulative dollar returns up through 2014, and then we're going to look at housing transaction 2015 through 2018. And these are dollar returns on the contribution amounts, where we've set aside the actual contributions themselves, so just the asset returns themselves. When we sort state borders into the lower windfall state and the higher windfall state, on the y-axis here, we have house prices. You can see that there's a very clear discontinuity in house prices as you move from a lower windfall to a higher windfall state. The property, the transaction price jumps up discontinuously. And that's effectively what we're going to measure, where we're going to scale it by the dollar, the size of the windfall. This is just a binary higher or lower windfall. When we do that in a regression setting, we find that for every dollar of windfall over that 12-year period, we see a $2 increase in housing prices in sales 2015 to 2018, $2.13. Now, there's a number of possible concerns you might have with that measure. There's lots of things going on inside of a pension system, I imagine. You guys know better than me. You might imagine that pension managers buy more shares in local firms. They tilt their portfolio towards local businesses. That's what we're going to call home bias. There's also possibly familiarity bias, where Texas is going to overemphasize oil or other commodities because it's what they think they know best. Or it could be reversed through a hedging consideration. But any sort of correlation here is going to cause problems in our estimates, because if the local economy performs well, that's going to directly impact house prices and directly impact portfolio performance. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some better measures of performance. We're going to look at returns in excess of the benchmark at an asset class level. So the PPD gives us all of this data. The good thing is that within asset class allocation decisions are not going to be reflected. So if you're overemphasizing investments in local companies, that's not going to show up. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. This is going to address familiarity bias. So this is where it's not going to matter what across asset class allocation you use. And then we're also going to look just at the benchmark returns, where picking or home bias is not going to matter, where we just have your asset class allocation decisions. The issue is that both of these address different problems, and to get at both, we're going to implement what we call the broad benchmark returns, where it's just like looking at benchmarks, but we're only going to look at the major asset classes. So there's not a lot of like the non-discretionary asset classes. It's the best we could do. There's still another concern, which I'll talk about in a second. But the good news is that we find when we properly deal with these in a two-stage setup, our estimates don't change that much. So there's not a lot of concern coming in our empirics from this. It remains consistently estimated across returns. The last thing that we can't deal with in that setup is any sort of time invariant factors at the state or the local level. And so what we do is we adjust our setting a little bit for property transactions between 2002 and 2018. We accumulate these pension windfalls up through the year before the sale, and then we can include what is ultimately a property fixed effect. So we're looking at the same property in a repeat sale way, and we show that while this value did go down, that's not a property fixed effect as much as the sample has been constrained to be, I'm sorry, not constrained, it's now including earlier transactions where there's less time for these pension returns to get impounded into property prices. Okay, the last remaining concern is about political mismanagement or corruption. So there's a paper from about 20 years ago that uses federal convictions as a measure of corruption, and they show that related to this corruption convictions is related to education, income inequality. There's lots of things that seem to correlate with corruption. So what we can do is we can show that, and this is a credit to you guys, the number of public corruption conviction charges is not correlated with the actual portfolio asset returns. Now, yesterday in the Q&A, someone jokingly posited that shortfalls are probably positively correlated with public corruption convictions. So I quickly ran that regression last night. It turns out they're negatively correlated. So there's no causal statement here, but the more public corruption convictions in a state year, the lower your shortfalls are. And so that's sort of a good news, bad news thing, and I don't want to investigate or think about that too hard. It doesn't matter for my paper, but okay. In our setting, though, the public corruption convictions are not changing this windfall. So it doesn't matter whether there's any sort of political mismanagement going on inside of the state or local government. It's not changing the way that this is valued by households. Okay, so just a little bit of robustness. I wanted to make sure we were right to focus on the border counties. And so if you look at our estimate at the border, it's about $2. And if we move to the interior of the state, we try and do what we thought ex ante was a bad idea. We see that this windfall is much smaller. That doesn't mean that interior counties value funding less. It's just that the incidence can fall on other things. What other things could it fall on? Going back to border counties, we look at UPC level average prices at a county month level. And we show that the fundedness of the pension system, pension windfalls, don't influence retail good prices at all. Again, this is the same setting where we're looking at retail goods on either side of a state border. We also don't see any difference in wages at a NAICS 4-digit, I believe. I didn't put that in the slide, sorry, level. So we don't see any difference in wages or in prices for consumers across the state border. And that's because if your pension system is underfunded or you're not getting as many windfalls, you can just work across the border or you can shop across the border very, very easily. Okay, so importantly, when we interact our windfall with muni bond spreads, we see that more financially constrained municipalities value these dollars inside the pension system more. When you can't borrow or borrowing is costly, it's very, very valuable if the pension system creates dollars for you. The households want it much, much more. They value it much, much more. And finally, my last heterogeneity result is I split states based on whether the Republicans or the Democrats controlled the state legislature. And we see that for Republican states, the value on these pension dollars is between 60 cents and $1.50, and for Democratic states, it's between $2 and $2.20. Now, there's no identification here. I don't have close elections as an instrument, so it's just suggestive, but there's possible interpretations here. You might think that Democrats invest in higher value projects, or alternatively, you might argue that Republicans have already invested in all the highest value projects, so their marginal dollars are worth less. The essential issue is that, for example, Republican voters elect Republican legislatures, and it's their perspective on the value of these dollars that matter. They don't value dollars inside the government to the same extent Democrats do. Whether that's reasonable or their perceptions or anything else, that's what we have going on here. So in conclusion, every dollar you make for a pension system, households value it at about $2. These marginal dollars get put to good use. They're spent on high-value projects, and that's great. Effects are strongest where fiscal constraints bind most. Thank you, guys.